Coming up on the Threat Status podcast, we talk to journalist and Washington Times contributor Seth Frantzman about the impending Israeli strike on Iran, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's political future, and how Israel views the Axis of Authoritarians. Then we dive into the game-changing news that North Korean troops are training in Russia and could soon be sent to the battlefield in Ukraine. And we dissect the apparent leak of classified U.S. documents assessing Israeli plans for its expected attack against Iran. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I'm joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. A lot happening right now, Guy. We're less than 2 weeks away from the election here in the U.S., and there are conflicts, of course, raging all around the world, and some major developments in the AI and tech worlds here at home. We'll get into all of that a little bit later in the show, but first things first, as always, what's on your radar right now?
Thanks, Ben. It's great to be here for another week on the podcast, and an interesting week it's been with all the warnings from U.S. intelligence, particularly about the prospect of disinformation by U.S. adversaries to try and sow discord and fake news narratives around the coming presidential election. I encourage listeners to Google, quote, ODNI foreign threats after election ends, end quote. And you'll come up with this declassified U.S. intel memo that has all sorts of eye-opening stuff in it, including the assessment that hackers tied to China, Russia, and Iran all have the, quote, technical capability, end quote, to hack into some U.S. election-related networks and systems. Interestingly, the memo says U.S. intelligence agencies assess that foreign actors will probably refrain from disruptive attacks that seek to specifically alter vote counts because they almost certainly would not be able to tangibly impact the outcome of the federal election without detection. And if they did get detected, it would carry a big risk of retaliation by the United States. I'm going to go further into this in my thread of the week at the end of the podcast, Ben. For now, there is one other major thing on my radar, and it's how Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin got on the board this week by announcing that he's seen evidence that North Korea has, in fact, sent military troops to Russia. Of course, we've had reporting for more than a week now that Ukrainian intelligence says more than 10,000 North Korean troops are already in Russia training and preparing for deployment, most likely into Ukraine, to aid Russian occupying forces there. This is like a slow-moving global security train wreck, Ben. I'm worried that it's not getting the kind of calm, sober, deep dive analysis that it deserves in the American mainstream media. We've tried to offer that in our reporting at Threat Status. Our Asia Bureau Chief, Andrew Salmon, had an extensive piece this week explaining the potentially game-changing implications this development carries if North Korea becomes the first outside power to directly intervene in the Russia-Ukraine war, and how this could pose perhaps the most serious challenge to date to the U.S. and its allies from the so-called Axis of Authoritarian powers, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. It's the same group that Secretary of State Antony Blinken himself has warned about. He's obviously avoided calling it an axis specifically, but he said these four countries are working together toward the goal of dismantling U.S. allies as well as U.S. currency and security and diplomatic dominance around the world. Well, we all want the violence to stop in Ukraine and for Russia to pull its troops back, Ben. I want our listeners to be aware that the war there could be expanding before our eyes in ways that change the power landscape of the region and the world as we head toward 2025 and the end of the first quarter of the 20th century.
Guy, I'm glad you brought this up because there's something I wanted to ask you as somebody I know who's covered North Korea and been to South Korea many times. We're at a point now. John Kirby at the White House just said recently this week that North Korean troops are now, quote, fair game, unquote, if they are actually deployed to the front lines of the war. So you're in a situation now where you could have North Korean troops potentially injured or even killed by U.S. weapons fired by the Ukrainian military.
Right.
What do you think the reaction would be in Pyongyang if that were to happen?
This is what I mean. We don't know what the reaction would be, but it could be rhetorical escalation or more tangible kinetic escalation. If we were to look at this North Korean troop movement as a kinetic escalation, it has implications. It also has implications for South Korea. The South Korean government has now repeatedly said, because of this, it's weighing sending weapons directly to Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, look, when we talked a few weeks ago, the title of the episode was "How Close Are We to World War III?" And that wasn't hyperbole or just rhetoric on our part. This is why when you start getting other countries drawn into conflicts, that's where things can spiral out of control quickly. It'll be a problem for the next president, that's for sure, whoever that might be, Donald Trump or Kamala Harris. And as I mentioned at the outset, the election is now 12 days away as we record this. It'll be even closer by the time you all listen to this. And we've talked a lot on this show about certain foreign policy planks of both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. We talked at length a few weeks ago about their positions on Ukraine, their positions on the Israel Hamas war, and now the Israel Hezbollah fighting and the broader Israel Iran conflict. That's important as well. And this is a really hard one for Kamala Harris. Wednesday night this week at a CNN town hall, she was asked point blank whether she's more, quote, pro-Israel, unquote, than Donald Trump. And she wouldn't say. She instead answered the question by saying, quote, I believe that Donald Trump is dangerous, unquote. So she's in a difficult spot, as we've talked about before. A couple weeks ago, she held a phone call with Jewish voters to try to reassure them about her commitment to Israel. She vowed Iran would not get a nuclear weapon on her watch, though, as I wrote about in the Washington Times this week, nobody seems to really know what her actual plan would be to keep that from happening. But at the same time, there's a big contingent on the left wing of the Democratic Party that is not very pro-Israel, to put it mildly. This administration, which of course includes Harris as the sitting vice president, is right now, as we record, threatening to cut military aid to Israel if it doesn't deliver more humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip. We'll talk more about that with Seth Frantzman here in a few minutes. But while we're on Israel and Iran, Guy, let's talk quickly about this apparent leak of internal U.S. assessments of the Israeli plans for a retaliatory strike against Iran. This is a big story, and for good reason. These documents are classified, and though they didn't seem to have any significant military details about Israel's plan or anything particularly sensitive at first, now there are signs that actually might not be the case. The Times of London reported today, Thursday, as we record, that after the documents were posted on Telegram late last week, Israel had to delay its plans for a retaliatory strike against Iran because of the leak. The report says there were fears inside Israel that the U.S. assessments could essentially help Iran predict Israel's pattern of attack. And so now they have to change that, go back to the drawing board. Is that true? I don't know. Is it possible that the Netanyahu government leaked that story because they want to make the Biden-Harris administration look bad and look anti-Israel? I don't know. I wouldn't say that's impossible. Here's what we do know, though, Guy. The leaker, assuming it is, in fact, a person from here in the U.S. and it wasn't some foreign hack, will eventually be caught. They almost always are. The FBI is investigating, and they're very, very good at this. So that'll be fascinating to watch because you have to presume there's a motive here, right? Why else would you leak this other than to potentially hurt Israel, hurt the U.S., or to help Iran? Now, we should know that the Pentagon denied this week that Aryan Tabatabai, the chief of staff to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations, was a subject of the federal inquiry, the FBI investigation. They're saying, no, she wasn't. Republicans on the Hill have long insisted that she's part of an effort orchestrated by Tehran to bolster Iran's public image. She's denied that, of course. So there's no reason, at least so far, to think that she's connected in any way. And I don't want to imply that in any way here on the podcast. But Guy, we've done a lot of reporting over the years about folks in the U.S., in corners of the government, at academic institutions, think tanks, other sectors who are at best sympathetic to the democratic policy goal of increased diplomacy and nuclear negotiations with Iran, or at worst, perhaps downright supportive of the regime in Tehran. So it's not out of the realm of possibility to me that one of those individuals could be connected to this leak in some way. Though we should stress again, there's no evidence of that yet. And this is mainly just educated speculation on our part. So I don't know. Maybe there's some grand plan here, or maybe there's just a 23-year-old somewhere who had access to these documents and uploaded them to Telegram without giving it much thought. To see how this plays out and the effect that it potentially has on Israel's retaliatory strike on Iran, especially now just days before the U.S. election, there's a lot of moving parts here that are going to impact people all over the world, Guy.
Yeah, Ben, I mean, I think if this was intentionally leaked, it's incredibly sensitive right now for the Biden and Harris administration, because if it turns out that it was a politically motivated leak, that's not going to help necessarily on the campaign trail. It could be very messy. At the same time, it could be a motivation to suppress evidence about who the leaker was until after the election. I don't have any information that that's the case. I'm just playing talking head speculator here, and you know how much I actually don't like doing that as a national security editor. But the political implications and the intersection between this leak and the campaign it's pretty obvious when you unpack it and think about it. It's really sensitive. And it's probably part of why this story has got such legs, because it doesn't sound like the geospatial satellite imagery was necessary. It was classified and sensitive, but it was necessarily determining exactly what the Israeli strike was. And we actually get into that with Seth Frantzman here. I actually think his explanation and view of the whole development is really sober and clear. Seth Frantzman is the senior Middle East correspondent and analyst at the Jerusalem Post. He's also an Israel-based adjunct fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where he often publishes analysis pieces on Mideast security dynamics. And finally, he's a key war correspondence contributor to Threat Status in the Washington Times. He's filed some eye-opening frontline reports for us since the October 7, 2023 Hamas attack on Israel. Seth, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Let's jump right into it. What kind of reaction is there in Israel, politically and publicly, this week to this U.S. intelligence leak development where apparently U.S. intelligence got leaked disclosing Israel's plans for a retaliatory strike on Iran? As you know, the FBI, there's actually an FBI investigation going on into this leak. What does it look like from there?
Well, I think that Israel officially is not commenting much on this. I mean, Israel prefers to focus on its own plans in terms of the potential attack on Iran, and also the fact that it's fighting a multi-front war against Hamas and Hezbollah. And Israel has a lot on its plate. It's also a holiday here over the last week. So I think, let the FBI or the U.S. do its job and try to clean this up. And I think that that's basically what Israel would prefer, as opposed to, if Israel were to talk a lot about this, then it would appear to be casting judgment on the U.S. intelligence community or other issues and the alliance. So it's probably in Israel's best interest just not to say much.
Is there a sense in the public that this could have been an intentional leak?
Well, I would assume any leak is probably intentional in a sense. So,
or somehow calculated and coordinated at a level other than just one individual leaker who's got any motive of any kind.
No, it does probably look like it would just be, one person or one or two people. I mean, the type of information that was leaked, if I've seen what I saw, was assessments that the U.S. was kind of carrying out, looking at what Israel was doing to prepare. So it wasn't a leak of information the Israelis had given America and then been leaked. It was basically U.S. looking at aerial photographs of planes and things and saying that Israel was basically doing what you'd expect Israel to be doing, which is practicing with air-launched ballistic missiles, practicing or preparing for some sort of a strike, which is kind of what people knew. So it's not as serious as Israel told the Americans they're going to attack X, Y, and Z, and that was leaked. That would be much more serious.
Seth, it's Ben Wolfgang. Thank you so much for joining us here. Staying on the potential retaliatory strike against Iran, what's your sense of the timing, best you can tell, on that right now? Why has it taken so long? And do you think there's any possibility that Prime Minister Netanyahu might be trying to time this in conjunction with the U.S. political calendar. Do you get the sense it's possible there's a calculus, perhaps, that maybe this strike helps Donald Trump or some other political calculation that's at work here?
Well, one would hope not, in the sense that you'd hope that no matter how cynical politics is, that someone would not time an unprecedented attack on Iran that could lead to a larger regional war just based on elections. That, I mean, that would be risking lives for something very cynical. However, that being said, I think that the time it's taken, shows that Israel is cautious. It shows that there's deep coordination with the United States, because the United States is sending over air defense batteries, which apparently means Israel either thinks it doesn't have enough, or it wants to make sure it has, 2 or 3 interceptors for every potential ballistic missile strike in terms of redundancy. So that means that a lot had to be done. It takes time to move all these air defense batteries, and you have to fly them over and make sure everything is positioned correctly. And this will be unprecedented. Israel has never carried out direct strikes on Iran before, at least publicly. So this is a big deal.
Seth, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken was in Israel this week pushing for momentum behind a possible truce. I want to ask you broadly, because Blinken left Israel and he went to Saudi Arabia. One, how was his visit perceived on the ground? And then two, he went to Saudi Arabia, and I have this broader question of, do you think there could be bigger Arab support, particularly from the Gulf Arab powers, Saudi Arabia specifically, for an expanded Israeli campaign against Hezbollah, as well as this retaliatory strike directly against Iran that we're talking about, given the crossover of Saudi interests with Israel on this and Saudi-Iran tensions?
Well, regarding the Secretary of State Antony Blinken's visit, it does seem that not much has so far come out of that, and I don't think there are much high hopes in Israel. I mean, for a year, Israel has been having these visits, and nothing seems to move in terms of the hostage issue. In part, that's because the U.S., quote, major non-NATO ally Qatar is the one that also hosts the current Hamas leadership. So it's a bit difficult to have your ally hosting the group that holds the hostages, and then have your other ally, Israel, wanting the hostages out, and they don't seem to come out. So I think Israel's just pretty pessimistic in terms of this ever is happening anytime soon. In terms of the Gulf support or tacit support for Israel expanding its war, I think Saudi Arabia for many years, was a guarantor in terms of Lebanon after the Lebanese Civil War after 1989 when it ended. The Saudis have deep interest in Lebanon, but they've been very disappointed to see the degree to which Hezbollah has a stranglehold there. So I'm sure those countries would be happy to see the weakening of Iran. On the other side of the coin, those countries are also hedging, because the Saudis have reconciled with the Iranians with Chinese-backed or broker reconciliation. So they are basically hedging on the fact that maybe Israel won't be able to reduce the Iranian control of the region.
While we're on the subject of Secretary of State Blinken and the Biden administration, I want to ask you, Seth, the administration recently, threatened to potentially cut its military support to Israel if Israel doesn't take steps to improve humanitarian conditions in the Gaza Strip. I'm just curious, we talk about the politics, the geopolitics of this, all day long, but I'm curious just from an on-the-ground military perspective, how long and to what extent could the IDF function right now at its current rate of operations, with operations in Gaza, obviously against Hezbollah in Lebanon? We're talking about the retaliatory strike against Iran. A lot of moving parts here. How long could the IDF keep that up if there were significant cuts in U.S. military support?
I think the IDF has spent, the last 80 or 90 years since Israel's establishment trying to make Israel relatively self-sufficient in terms of lots of types of munitions and certain things. But there's always going to be stuff that Israel doesn't make itself. Israel doesn't build F-35s. There's certain types of bombs that Israel doesn't make, obviously. So I think that eventually it would definitely hurt Israel, but I think Israel has also stockpiled lots of different munitions that it needs for a long war. Israel spent the last year understanding that, and it's put billions of dollars into production lines. So I think that's the reality. And I assume any American cuts would have some proviso in terms of cutting types of munitions being used in Gaza, but not cutting munitions being used that might be used to defend against Iran. So it might be one of those things a bit of a shell game where you have, you have things in one place that you take away, but you put them somewhere else. And I doubt that Israel would be left, completely defenseless. So I think that there's a lot of talk, which is basically meant to, raise some eyebrows in Israel and get the Israelis to do what the Americans want them to do, which is talk more about aid in Gaza. And Israel's doing that.
I was going to ask that. Is there a sense you think that this is a bluff? Do some of the Israeli government think that the U.S. wouldn't actually follow through on something like this?
Yeah, I think, look, there's American elections anyway coming up. So there's a big question mark there. And then, of course, there will be Congress would have to, there'd be other voices regarding this. So it's not just a bluff. I think that Israel understands the messaging, and Israel tries to then afterward. We saw within the last week, every day almost, Israel announcing how much aid is going into Gaza in order to basically say, yes, we understand your concerns. Here's what we're trying to do. So I think Israel does listen, and that the message was received.
Seth, I want to do a quick one on Netanyahu and the politics around him right now. Yeah, how strong is his political position domestically? And is this kind of level of arguing that we hear about inside his government, is that normal? Or is there actually deep division between Defense Minister Yoav Gallant and Netanyahu, also with former Defense Minister Benny Gantz and Netanyahu? What do you read on that?
Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been in charge for a very long time, an unprecedented amount of time in Israel's history. He's been able to maintain that control over the politics because he receives about 30% of the vote each time, and that's enough to bring in coalition partners that support him. Mostly on the religious right is what he counts on. I think that his polls have slipped a bit after October 7th because of this huge massacre and mess up. But he's been crawling back bit by bit in terms of the numbers. And I think that he, if there were an election held today, there's a possibility he would still hang on. I think that the Yoav Gallant issue, Gallant is a member of his party, but I think that Yoav Gallant has always tried to steer his own course. And Gallant also very much wanted this Lebanon war to happen earlier than it did. So I think Gallant has sort of he's kind of gotten what he wants now. And I think he feels that the prime minister is just too cautious and not willing to take some bold initiatives. And therefore, the war is just going on and on without any clear vision. I think that's where Gallant certainly differs from the prime minister. And obviously, the opposition parties, they agree on lots of things with the government. They agree on, fighting terrorists, but they also want to see what a day after plan, and they want the hostages back. And they feel that the government has not done enough to bring home the hostages.
Seth, I'm curious to get your take on this because I've been fascinated by, watching from afar from the West, whether Netanyahu is somebody who cares about his legacy per se, quote unquote legacy. Did you get the sense that he wants to go down as being remembered as somebody who, permanently helped dismantle the axis of resistance, Iran's axis of resistance, just, dealt potentially lethal blows to Hamas, to Hezbollah? Does he sort of see himself in that grand, legacy point of view? Does that factor into his decision-making based on what you've seen covering him for so long?
I think Netanyahu, prides himself in terms of how he views himself, in terms of being a great strategist and keeping Israel secure and being Mr. Security. And however, if you look at October 7th and the fact that the Iranian Axis has actually in the last 15, 20 years, while Netanyahu was in power, it's become exponentially more powerful. I mean, that's the reality of Hezbollah. It went from 13,000 rockets to 150,000. Hamas, became capable of carrying out the worst attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. So, Netanyahu has a view of himself of what he's accomplished. And yes, he'd love to go down in history books as someone who's kind of a Churchillian-like figure, but I think he's going to have a difficulty with that. And I think that also the evidence will show that even though he has done unprecedented steps in terms of killing, Nasrallah, and then the killing of Sinwar, even though that happened kind of by mistake, he's done unprecedented things, but he's going to have to get to the end zone. And so far, the issue that Netanyahu's always faced is that he's very good at the day-to-day, and he has a vision, but he's not always good at decisive action and taking bold steps or risks, which are the kind of things in war you have to do if you want to actually decisively win at some point, as opposed to just fight for a very long time.
Seth, one more just to close us out here. We talk a lot on this show, and I think rightfully so, about the axis of authoritarians or the axis of autocracies, or whatever you want to call it, typically defined as China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. Some would say now Venezuela and Cuba, included in that as well. I'm curious, sort of how Israel views that axis. Obviously, Iran and Israel are at each other's throats right now. We've talked about the potential retaliatory strike from Israel against Iran. Iran's a close ally of Russia. Russia's a close ally of North Korea. North Korean troops are now reportedly inside Russia training and could be sent to the front lines of Russia's war in Ukraine. How does that idea of an axis play in Israel? Do Israelis, generally government officials included, see it the same way we do? In other words, if Iran is an enemy of Israel, does that make other members of the Axis, Russia, North Korea, China, even Venezuela? Is Israel starting to see them as enemies or adversaries as well?
For a long time, Israel entertained the idea that it could get along with Russia and China in a way that the West generally did not. And that's because you have, people in Israel who are from Russia. You have a slightly different, the makeup of Israel is just different. It's people that come from Central and Eastern Europe as well as the West. So I think there was entertainment of that idea. And obviously Israel understood that Iran is the main enemy, but I don't think Israel was on key with the messaging of this authoritarian issue. I think now Israel's woken up from that after October 7th, because I think everyone now should understand China, Russia are involved with the Iranian axis, and other countries that you mentioned. Venezuela is extremely hostile to Israel. There's other countries. North Korea has been involved with Iran in the past with munitions and ballistic missiles and stuff. So Israel certainly needs to understand that. I think generally just Israel is more concerned about its neighborhood, because it has to fight groups that are very close to home, and it can't do as much in terms of worrying about the whole world. But that being said, Israel's friends in Asia, where does Israel sell arms in Asia? It's places like Singapore, South Korea. These are all parts of the democratic, Western world order alliance system, and Israel is very much knitted into that alliance system.
Seth Frantzman, thank you so much for joining us on the Threat Status Podcast.
Thanks, Seth.
Thank you.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's here at home, domestically, or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now, this week, as you're listening to the show. Guy, my threat this week is plagiarism by chatbots. Now, talk about a fascinating story here. This week, News Corp, the massive news conglomerate that owns the Wall Street Journal, New York Post, Dow Jones, filed what is essentially a chatbot plagiarism lawsuit against Perplexity AI, a Silicon Valley tech firm that, as the name implies, is deeply involved in AI. A lot of listeners may have used this already and could be familiar with it, but Perplexity essentially has an AI-powered search engine that gathers information from all across the internet and delivers you answers based on the algorithm that it built. Just a quick note, an aside here on the amount of money we're talking about here, because Jeff Bezos is a major investor in the firm, which back in January was valued at $520 million. By June, that had shot up to $3 billion. Now the company is reportedly in talks for a $9 billion valuation, which means Jeff Bezos is going to make a lot more money. So good for him. But why is this my threat of the week? Well, because I'm a journalist and we're terrified that AI is going to take our jobs. And I'm exaggerating a little, but there's a serious issue at the core of this. The News Corp lawsuit alleges that Perplexity's AI chatbot allegedly reproduces content from News Corp publications like Wall Street Journal articles, for example, in its responses, sometimes verbatim, word for word, and doesn't credit or link back to the source. And it's not just News Corp. Last week, the New York Times reportedly sent a cease and desist letter demanding that Perplexity stop using New York Times content in its search responses. Now, in an ironic twist, Perplexity CEO Aravan Srinivas, forgive me if I got that name wrong, appeared this week at a major tech conference hosted by the Wall Street Journal, not even 2 days after the News Corp lawsuit. He said the company was surprised and that they've been trying to have an open line of communication with News Corp and other organizations. So look, This lawsuit could turn out to be a huge deal, Guy, because it could set new standards for what constitutes plagiarism by a chatbot or some other AI tool. If an algorithm pulls something that you wrote on Twitter and disseminates it across the internet without giving you credit for it, is that unethical or should it be illegal? I'm not sure. But right now it's a threat because we're at a dangerous moment of misinformation, disinformation, potential confusion around the election, AI generated content, deep fakes, and all the rest. We don't need to add plagiarism to the mix too. And we in the US government and the tech industry should be doing everything in our power to make sure that we all know where the content that we're reading, watching, or listening to actually came from.
Interesting, Ben. My thread of the week is similar, but I just put it in different terms, I guess. And that's fake news and politicized disinformation, including deep fake videos being disseminated through US social media at unprecedented rates because of artificial intelligence tools during the days immediately before, during, and after the coming US election. We have an exclusive article and threat status influencers video interview with Senate Intelligence Committee Chairman Mark Warner that we've just published, where Senator Warner dives into this stuff, and he specifically talks about the likelihood of ramped up disinformation efforts by China and Iran connected operatives that will take hold if the U.S. election vote count is as close as anticipated, particularly if the election is not decided in a single day or two. Imagine seeing videos on your social media feed as you lay in bed at night, videos that you don't know are real or not, because they may be deep fakes and they're showing alleged election officials tearing up ballots, things like that. Ben, that's my thread of the week.
Yeah, and we're entering uncharted territory with a lot of this stuff, to say the least. So thank you very much for that. A huge thanks to Seth Frantzman for joining us on the show, and a big thanks to all of you for listening. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, and share with all your friends. We'll be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.